She knelt in the dirt, offering her own life in exchange for a crust of bread. But the Lakota scout who found her starving gave her something no one else ever had: dignity, purpose, and a love that would defy two worlds. Wyoming Territory. 1876. The land stretched endless and unforgiving beneath a sky the color of old pewter, where hope went to die and dreams turned to dust. The wind carried stories of broken treaties and broken families, of settlers who had ventured too far west and discovered that the frontier took more than it gave. Between the rolling hills and scattered homesteads lay a wasteland of failed ambitions, where wooden crosses marked graves of those who had dared to believe they could tame the wilderness. The drought had lasted 3 years, turning fertile soil into cracked earth that split like old leather.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Rivers that once ran clear and cold now showed only muddy trickles, barely enough to sustain the hardiest of creatures. Cattle lay bleaching in the sun, their bones picked clean by buzzards. And time. The few remaining settlements clung to existence like stubborn weeds, their inhabitants growing thinner and more desperate with each passing season. This was the year when the buffalo herds failed to return from the south, when the cavalry pushed deeper into tribal lands, when both white settlers and native peoples found themselves caught between the grinding stones of progress and survival. The territorial government had promised protection and prosperity to those brave enough to claim homesteads, but those promises had proven as ephemeral as morning mist. What remained was a harsh reality where only the strongest, the most adaptable, or the most ruthless managed to endure. The Stonefield homestead sat 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, a collection of weathered buildings that had once represented dreams of prosperity and independence. Now the barn sagged under the weight of too many harsh winters. The chicken coop stood empty except for feathers and memories, and the vegetable garden yielded nothing but disappointment and dust. The well that had once provided sweet water now gave up only bitter dregs that tasted of minerals and despair. Vera Stonefield moved through this desolation with the careful steps of someone who had learned to conserve every ounce of energy. At 22, she possessed the kind of beauty that hardship could not entirely erase: auburn hair that caught sunlight like captured fire, green eyes that still held traces of the determination that had brought her family west, and hands that bore the calluses of honest work. But hunger had carved hollows in her cheeks, and worry had drawn lines around her eyes that made her appear older than her years. She shared this failing homestead with her younger brother Samuel, 16 and growing tall despite the meager rations they survived on. Samuel possessed their father's stubborn optimism and their mother's gentle heart, believing even now that rain would come, that crops would grow, that somehow they would find a way to survive another season. Vera had stopped believing in miracles 2 seasons ago, but she continued to hope for Samuel's sake, understanding that hope was sometimes the only nourishment that kept a person alive. The Stonefield family had arrived in Wyoming Territory 5 years earlier, part of the great wave of settlers following the promise of free land and fresh starts. Thomas Stonefield had been a carpenter back in Ohio, skilled with his hands and confident in his ability to build a new life from raw timber and determination. Their mother, Mary, had been a schoolteacher who dreamed of starting the first proper school in their new community. They had brought with them not just their possessions, but their faith in the American promise that hard work and moral character would inevitably lead to prosperity. Their parents had died the previous winter first, their mother from fever, then their father from a combination of grief and exhaustion that the doctor had simply called failure to thrive. Before his death, Thomas Stonefield had made Vera promise to take care of Samuel, to never let him face the world alone. It was a promise that now felt like a chain around her neck, growing heavier with each day they survived on shorter rations. The decline had been gradual at first, then precipitous. The first year had brought a decent harvest, enough to see them through winter with some despair. The second year had been harder, with early frosts killing half their crops, but they had managed. The third year brought the drought, and with it a cascade of failures that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Their neighbors had begun abandoning their claims one by one. The Hendersons had left for California after their youngest child died of fever. The McKinneys had returned east after losing their entire herd to disease. The Walkers had simply disappeared one night, leaving behind only a note saying they had gone to try their luck in the gold fields of Colorado. Each departure felt like another nail in the coffin of their community's dreams. The last of their stored grain had been consumed 2 weeks ago. Their final chicken had provided one last meal 3 days past. Yesterday, they had boiled leather strips to make a thin soup that tasted of desperation and salt. Today, Vera stared into their empty root cellar and faced a truth that had been stalking them like a patient predator. They were going to starve. Samuel tried to maintain hope with the fierce determination of youth. "Maybe we could hunt rabbits," he suggested, though they had no ammunition for their father's old rifle. "Or gather berries, though they both knew the drought had killed most of the wild plants. Or trade something with the Hendersons, though." The Hendersons had abandoned their homestead a month ago, leaving nothing behind but empty windows staring at the endless sky. Vera had heard stories about Fort Laramie, the military outpost 40 miles east where soldiers received regular supply shipments from back east. She had also heard darker stories about what desperate women sometimes traded for food, about the wives and daughters of failed homesteaders who had sold their dignity for survival. The thought made her stomach turn, but desperation had a way of making the unthinkable seem reasonable. But Fort Laramie was 40 miles away, and they had no horse, no wagon, no means of transportation except their own feet. In their weakened condition, such a journey would likely kill them both before they reached help. There had to be another way, some solution that didn't require them to leave their land or compromise their principles. It was Samuel who mentioned the trading post. "Remember what Pa said about old Morrison's place? How he used to trade with the Indians before the troubles started?" Morrison's trading post sat 15 miles north, abandoned since the Indian Wars had heated up 2 years prior. But sometimes, Samuel had heard, desperate people still went there hoping to find someone willing to trade. Morrison had been a legend in the territory, a man who had learned to speak multiple tribal languages and had built his business on mutual respect rather than exploitation. His post had been neutral ground where whites and various tribes could meet safely to exchange goods and information. But when tensions escalated and the army began demanding that civilians choose sides, Morrison had been caught in the middle. His refusal to spy on his tribal trading partners had made him suspect to the military, while his white heritage made him unwelcome in many tribal camps. Eventually, he had simply vanished. Leaving his trading post to the elements and the memories, they left at dawn, carrying nothing but their father's old canteen half filled with bitter well water and their mother's Bible wrapped in oilcloth. Vera wore her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been beautiful, hoping that appearing respectable might help in whatever negotiations lay ahead. Samuel carried the family's last valuable possession, their father's pocket watch, a silver timepiece that had belonged to his grandfather. The walk to Morrison's took 6 hours through terrain that grew increasingly wild and untamed. They passed abandoned homesteads where families had given up their dreams, empty corrals where cattle had once grazed, and dried creek beds that spoke of better times when water flowed freely across the land. With each mile, civilization fell further behind, and the vast loneliness of the frontier pressed closer around them. The landscape told stories of both triumph and failure. Here was a partially built cabin, its walls rising only 3 feet before the builders had given up or died. There was a carefully planted orchard, now withered and dead, representing someone's dream of bringing eastern fruit to western soil.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Scattered throughout were the graves, some marked with proper headstones, others with simple wooden crosses, and many with nothing but piles of stones to mark where hope had finally surrendered to reality. By midday, the sun had become their enemy, beating down with merciless intensity. They had finished their water an hour before, and their lips were already beginning to crack from dehydration. Vera found herself thinking of their mother, who had always warned them about the dangers of traveling unprepared. But preparation required resources they simply didn't possess. By afternoon, they were stumbling more than walking. The sun beat down mercilessly, and their meager water supply was nearly exhausted. Samuel began to lag behind, his young face pale with exhaustion and dehydration. Vera forced herself to keep moving, driven by the terrible responsibility of being the older sibling, the one who had to be strong when strength seemed impossible. She began to tell Samuel stories to keep his mind off their suffering tales their mother had shared about their grandparents, accounts of their father's woodworking projects, memories of better times when their future had seemed bright with possibility. But even these verbal diversions became difficult as their throats grew raw and their voices began to fail. The trading post appeared like a mirage in the heat shimmer, a collection of weathered buildings surrounding a central courtyard where wagons had once gathered to trade goods with travelers and tribes alike. But as they drew closer, it became clear that the post had been abandoned for months. Windows were broken, doors hung askew, and weeds grew through the floorboards of what had once been a thriving center of commerce. The main building had been constructed with obvious care, its logs fitted together with the precision of a master craftsman. Morrison had built it to last with thick walls that could withstand both weather and potential attacks. The trading room still contained remnants of its former purpose, empty shelves where goods had once been displayed, a massive stone fireplace where travelers had warmed themselves, and a heavy wooden counter scarred by years of negotiations. Samuel collapsed in the shade of the main building, too exhausted to continue. Vera searched desperately through the abandoned structures, hoping to find some forgotten cache of supplies, some overlooked store of food or medicine. But the buildings had been stripped clean long ago, leaving nothing but dust and disappointment. She found evidence of Morrison's careful planning everywhere she looked. A root cellar designed to keep food fresh through the harshest seasons, now empty. A stable built to house dozens of horses, now occupied only by old hay and mice. A workshop where repairs could be made to wagons and equipment, its tools long since carried away by scavengers. Even in abandonment, the post spoke of better times when cooperation and mutual benefit had seemed possible. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Vera faced a horrifying realization. They were too weak to make the journey home. They had wagered everything on finding help at Morrison's, and they had lost. Samuel was barely conscious, his lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. They were going to die here in this abandoned place, far from home and family, their bones destined to join the countless others who had perished pursuing dreams too large for the harsh reality of the frontier. She knelt beside her brother, checking his pulse with fingers that trembled from more than exhaustion. His heartbeat was weak but steady, and his breathing, though shallow, continued. She had perhaps a few hours before dehydration claimed him completely. The thought of watching Samuel die, of failing in her promise to their father, filled her with a despair so complete that she almost welcomed the approaching darkness. It was then that Vera heard the horses. 3 riders approached from the east, their silhouettes wavering in the heat like dark spirits. As they drew closer, she could see they were white men traders or prospectors by their rough clothing and heavily loaded pack animals. They might have food, water, supplies. They might be her brother's salvation. The men dismounted in the courtyard, Their leader a tall man with graying hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to take inventory of everything they saw. His companions were younger, harder-looking men with the kind of faces that suggested they were accustomed to taking what they wanted without asking permission. Their horses were well-fed and their equipment was expensive, suggesting they were successful in whatever business they pursued. Well, the leader said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had grown comfortable with other people's desperation. What have we here? A couple of lost lambs far from their flock. His gaze lingered on Vera in a way that made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to step forward. The man's accent suggested education, perhaps, even refinement, but his eyes held the calculating coldness of a predator. His clothes were well made but practical, designed for long travel in rough conditions. The gun on his hip was clean and well maintained, suggesting familiarity with violence. Everything about him screamed danger, but he was also her only hope. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother is dying. We need food, water. I'll give you anything I have." She pulled out their father's pocket watch, the silver gleaming in the afternoon light. "This is worth something. It's all we have left." The man examined the watch with the practiced eye of someone who knew the value of desperate people's treasures. He opened it to check the mechanism, noted the inscription inside, and weighed it in his palm like a merchant evaluating goods. "Pretty piece," he admitted. "Might be worth a meal or two. But what else you got, girl? A man doesn't travel this far into the wilderness for pocket watches." Vera's heart sank as she realized what he was suggesting. She looked back at Samuel, who lay motionless in the shade, his breathing shallow and labored. In that moment, she understood that she had reached the point where all choices were terrible, where survival required sacrifices that would haunt her forever. "I'll work for you," she said desperately. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I'm strong. I can earn my keep." But even as she spoke the words, she knew what kind of work these men had in mind, and it had nothing to do with cooking or cleaning. The leader smiled, and it was the most frightening expression Vera had ever seen. "Now that's more like it. A girl with sense. Tell you what, you come with us. Provide us with companionship for, say, 6 months, and we'll make sure your brother gets fed and taken to someplace safe. Fair trade, wouldn't you say?" His companions laughed at this proposal, their amusement carrying undertones that made Vera's stomach turn. She understood now that these were not honest traders, but something far worse, men who dealt in human misery, who preyed on the desperate and the defenseless. But they were also her brother's only chance at survival. Vera looked at Samuel, unconscious and dying, then back at the 3 men who held his life in their hands. She had heard stories of women who had made such bargains, who had traded their bodies and souls for survival. Most of those stories ended badly, but some of the women had lived. Some had found ways to endure until they could escape or until circumstances changed. She closed her eyes and thought of her promise to her dying father, to never let Samuel face the world alone. If she died here, he would die too. If she went with these men, at least he might live. The choice was no choice at all. "I accept," she whispered, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "But first you feed him. You give him water and food. And you promise me he'll be taken somewhere safe." The leader nodded, already reaching for the supplies on his pack horse. "Deal. Boys, break out some hardtack and jerky for the young one. And water, give him all he can drink." He turned back to Vera with that same terrible smile. "As for you, sweetheart, we'll get you cleaned up and ready for your new life. You're going to be very popular where we're headed." As the men began unpacking their supplies, as Samuel stirred at the smell of food and the promise of water, Vera felt her soul shrinking inside her body. She had always believed that virtue and determination would be enough to see her through any trial. But the frontier had taught her that sometimes survival required compromises that destroyed the very thing you were trying to preserve. But as the men began unpacking their supplies, as Samuel stirred at the smell of food and the promise of water, none of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above the trading post. Chayton Ironwolf sat motionless on his painted horse, his dark eyes taking in the scene below with the patience of a natural predator. He had been tracking these men for 3 days, knowing their reputation, understanding their methods. What he hadn't expected was to find a young woman offering her life for her brother's survival, displaying the kind of courage and selflessness that his own people valued above all other virtues. As he watched her help Samuel drink from a water flask, her own desperate thirst forgotten in her concern for him, Chayton made a decision that would change the course of 3 lives forever. The Lakota scout touched his heels to his horse's flanks and began his descent toward the trading post, his hand resting lightly on the rifle across his saddle. He had no particular love for white settlers, but he had even less tolerance for men who preyed on the desperate and defenseless. And something about the girl's sacrifice, her willingness to give everything for family, reminded him of virtues his own people held sacred. The painted horse picked its way down the rocky slope with the sure-footed grace of an animal born to mountain terrain. Chayton Ironwolf rode with the easy balance of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than on foot, his body moving in perfect harmony with his mount's rhythm. At 28, he possessed the lean, powerful build of a warrior who had survived countless battles and hunts, his bronze skin marked by scars that told stories of courage and survival. His black hair hung in 2 braids wrapped with strips of leather and small bones, traditional markers of his status as a scout and tracker. He had been watching the trading post for the better part of an hour, hidden among the rocks and scrub brush that crowned the ridge. The 3 white men below had made no effort to conceal their approach or their intentions, confident in their ability to take what they wanted without consequence. Chayton had encountered their type before, predators who operated in the lawless spaces between settlements, preying on the desperate and the defenseless. His horse, a sturdy paint mare, named Ayana after the eternal blossom of his people's legends, sensed her rider's tension and responded with increased alertness. Her ears swiveled constantly, monitoring the sounds from the trading post below while remaining ready to flee or fight as circumstances demanded. The bond between Chayton and Ayana had been forged through years of shared danger and mutual dependence, creating a partnership that transcended the usual relationship between man and beast. As they descended, Chayton's mind worked through the tactical situation with the methodical precision of an experienced warrior. 3 armed men, possibly more weapons than he could immediately see, positioned in defensive terrain around the trading post. The girl and her brother were liabilities in any confrontation, too weak to help and too vulnerable to ignore. The element of surprise would be crucial, but so would timing. Chayton had been born into the Oglala Lakota, during the time when his people still believed accommodation with the white settlers might be possible. His father, a respected war chief, named Mapia Luda, had taught him that courage meant protecting those who could not protect themselves, regardless of their tribal affiliation. His mother, a skilled healer named Winona, had instilled in him the belief that all life was sacred and that true strength came from wisdom rather than violence. But the years had taught him harsh lessons about the nature of the expanding white civilization. He had witnessed the broken treaties, the casual slaughter of buffalo herds, the systematic destruction of his people's way of life. He had fought in battles where honor meant nothing and survival meant everything. He had seen good men on both sides destroyed by hatred and fear, and he had learned that the line between civilization and savagery was often thinner than most people wanted to believe. The recent defeat of General Custer at the Little Bighorn had brought temporary victory to the allied tribes, but Chayton understood that it was merely a postponement of the inevitable. The white soldiers would return in greater numbers, with better weapons and deeper hatred. The golden age of the Plains tribes was ending, and men like him caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither, would have to choose how to spend their remaining years of freedom, he had chosen to become a scout, using his knowledge of both cultures to navigate the dangerous spaces between them. Sometimes he guided army patrols, trading information for supplies and temporary safety for his people. Other times he warned tribal camps of approaching danger, using his mobility and knowledge of white tactics to save lives. It was a precarious existence that earned him suspicion from both sides, but it allowed him to follow his own moral compass rather than the dictates of either culture. Shappa emerged from the rocks with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, his rifle held casually, but ready. The three men at the trading post noticed him immediately, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. But something in his posture, confident without being threatening, alert without being aggressive, caused them to hesitate rather than draw iron. "Good afternoon," he said in English, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had learned the language through careful study rather than native birth. "I could not help but notice your generosity toward these travelers. It is good to see such kindness in hard times." The leader of the three men, the one with cold blue eyes and graying hair, studied this unexpected arrival with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential threat. Shappa's appearance, clearly Native American, but dressed in a mixture of traditional and white clothing, marked him as one of the increasing number of individuals who moved between worlds. Such men could be useful allies or dangerous enemies, depending on their motivations and allegiances. "Indian," the leader said, his tone carefully neutral. "You're a long way from any reservation, friend. Might be dangerous for a lone brave to be wandering around these parts. What with all the troubles lately?" Chayton smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "I am Chayton Ironwolf of the Oglala, Lakota. I scout for the army when they pay well, and I trade with honest men when I find them. As for danger, I have found that it usually comes from those who speak of it most often." The casual mention of his connection to the army caused visible tension among the three men. If this Indian was indeed a scout, he might have information about troop movements or patrol schedules. More importantly, he might be expected somewhere, which would complicate any plans they had for the girl and her brother. Vera watched this exchange with growing hope mixed with terror. The arrival of the Lakota scout had clearly unsettled her captors, but she had no way of knowing whether this development would improve or worsen their situation. Stories of Indian attacks on white settlers filled every newspaper and campfire conversation, creating a mythology of savage violence that few questioned. But as she observed Chayton more closely, she noticed details that contradicted the popular stereotypes. His English was precise and educated, suggesting formal schooling or extensive contact with white culture. His clothing combined traditional Native American elements with practical frontier wear, indicating someone who moved comfortably between different worlds. Most importantly, his eyes held intelligence and compassion rather than the mindless hostility she had been taught to expect. Samuel had managed to drink some water and eat a few pieces of hardtack, and the food had revived him enough to sit up and take notice of their surroundings. When he saw Chayton, his eyes widened with a mixture of fear and fascination. Like most young men of his generation, he had grown up on stories of Indian warriors and frontier battles, but he had never actually encountered a Native American in person. "Vera," he whispered, his voice hoarse from dehydration. "Who is that man? Is he going to help us or hurt us?" Vera had no answer for her brother's question. Everything she had been taught about Indians suggested they were dangerous, enemies of white civilization. But everything she could observe about this particular man suggested someone who might be their salvation. She found herself caught between inherited prejudices and desperate hope. The leader of the three men decided to take a direct approach. "Well, Scout, since you're here, maybe you can help us with a little problem. We've got this girl and her brother here, and they're in need of assistance. We're prepared to help them, but we need to work out the terms of our arrangement." Chayton's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened as he studied the scene more carefully. The girl's torn dress and desperate expression told one story, while the men's confident postures and expensive equipment told another. The dynamics of the situation became clear to him with the sudden clarity of a hunter spotting prey. "What sort of arrangement?" he asked, his tone conversational but alert. "In my experience, the best arrangements are those that benefit everyone involved. What do you propose to offer in exchange for what services?" The leader smiled, recognizing a potential ally in someone who spoke the language of practical negotiation. "The girl needs food and protection. We can provide both. In return, she provides us with companionship during our travels. Simple business arrangement, everyone gets what they need." Chayton nodded slowly, as if considering the proposition. "And the boy? What provision do you make for him?" "We'll see that he gets to a town. Maybe find him work with a family that can use an extra hand. Kid's old enough to earn his keep if he's willing to work." The casual dismissal of Samuel's welfare, the reduction of Vera's situation to a simple business transaction, and the underlying threat of violence if cooperation was not forthcoming, all combined to trigger something deep and fierce in Chayton's warrior soul. But years of surviving in a hostile environment had taught him the value of patience and careful planning. Chayton had witnessed enough suffering on both sides of the cultural divide to understand that survival often required difficult choices. He had seen white families destroyed by war parties, and he had watched his own people starve on reservations where promised government supplies never arrived. The frontier created situations where traditional moral frameworks broke down, leaving individuals to navigate impossible choices with insufficient information and inadequate resources. But there were still lines that should not be crossed. Standards that defined the difference between necessity and evil. The systematic exploitation of the desperate, the reduction of human beings to commodities, the casual destruction of families. These were the behaviors that marked the difference between civilization and barbarism, regardless of the skin color of those who practiced them. As he watched Vera help her brother drink more water, her own desperate thirst forgotten in her concern for his welfare, Chayton recognized a quality that his own people valued above all others: the willingness to sacrifice oneself for family. This was not the behavior of the savage, degenerate race that white newspapers described. This was the behavior of someone who understood that some things were more important than individual survival. His decision crystallized with the sudden clarity of a winter morning. These men represented everything he had learned to hate about. The worst aspects of white civilization, the casual cruelty, the reduction of human relationships to economic transactions, the assumption that might made right. The girl and her brother represented something else entirely, the kind of courage and dignity that transcended cultural boundaries. "I have a counter-proposal," Chayton said, his voice carrying a new edge of authority. "The girl and her brother are under my protection now. I will provide them with food, water, and safe passage to wherever they wish to go. In return, you gentlemen will continue your journey without further delay." The leader's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of calculating hostility. "Now see here, Indian. We were here first, and we've already made our arrangements with the girl. You've got no claim on these people, and you've got no authority to interfere with our business." Chayton's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his rifle. "My authority comes from the same source as yours, the willingness to use force, to protect what I value. The difference is that I value human dignity more than personal pleasure." The tension in the courtyard ratcheted up several degrees as all parties recognized that the situation had moved beyond negotiation toward potential violence. The two younger men spread out slightly, positioning themselves to create crossfire if shooting started. The leader's hand inched toward his pistol, while his eyes calculated odds and angles. Vera understood that her next words might determine whether people lived or died in the next few minutes. She had no idea whether the Lakota scout could be trusted, but she knew with absolute certainty that the three white men represented a fate worse than death. The choice, if it could be called a choice, was clear. "I accept your protection. She said to Chaitin, her voice stronger than she had expected. "My brother and I place ourselves under your care." The leader's face flushed with anger and frustration. "Girl, you're making a big mistake. You think this savage is going to treat you better than civilized men. You think he's going to respect your virtue and your safety. You're trading known quantities for unknown dangers." Chaitin's laugh was soft but carried an edge of genuine amusement. "Civilized men. Yes, I have met many of your civilized men. They sign treaties and break them. They make promises and forget them. They speak of honor and practice treachery. If this is civilization, then I am proud to be called savage." The courtyard of Morrison's trading post had become a stage for a confrontation that represented larger conflicts playing out across the American frontier. 3 armed white men who viewed human beings as commodities to be bought and sold faced off against a single Lakota warrior who had chosen to intervene on behalf of 2 desperate strangers. The outcome would depend not just on marksmanship and tactics, but on courage, determination, and the willingness to risk everything for principles that most people claim to value but few were willing to die for. Chaitin's tactical assessment of the situation was grim but not hopeless. The 3 men had superior numbers and were well armed, but they were also positioned in an open area with limited cover. His own position near the rocks provided some protection, and his horse could provide rapid mobility if retreat became necessary. Most importantly, he had the advantage of fighting for something he believed in. While his opponents were motivated primarily by greed and lust, the leader of the 3 men was clearly the most dangerous, possessing both the experience and the ruthlessness necessary for frontier violence. But he was also the most calculating, which meant he might be willing to retreat if the odds turned against him. The 2 younger men were wild cards, possibly more impulsive but also potentially less skilled in actual combat. "This is your last chance, Indian," the leader said, his hand now resting openly on his pistol grip. "Walk away now, and we'll call this a misunderstanding. Stay, and we'll add your scalp to our collection." Chaitin's response was to slide his rifle into position with fluid grace, the weapon trained on the leader's chest. "I am Chaitin Iron Wolf, son of Mapia Luda, grandson of warriors who died fighting for their people. I do not walk away from threats, and I do not abandon those who have asked for my protection." The standoff stretched for long seconds as each side waited for the other to make the first move. Vera held her breath, her arms wrapped protectively around Samuel, who had managed to struggle to his feet despite his weakness. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the abandoned trading post, creating a hellish tableau of human conflict played out against the backdrop of endless sky. Then, unexpectedly, the leader smiled and stepped back. "Boys, I think we've overstayed our welcome. Let's find more hospitable territory for our business." His 2 companions looked confused but followed his lead, moving toward their horses with careful deliberation. The leader kept his eyes on Chaitin throughout the withdrawal, making it clear that this was a tactical retreat rather than a surrender. As the 3 men mounted their horses and rode away, Vera felt her legs give out beneath her. The combination of exhaustion, dehydration, fear, and relief had pushed her beyond her physical limits. She collapsed to her knees in the dust, her body shaking with reaction to the confrontation she had just witnessed. Chaitin dismounted and approached her carefully, his movements slow and non-threatening. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the authority he had displayed moments before. "Do you need immediate medical attention?" "I think I'm all right," Vera managed to say, though her voice shook with exhaustion and emotion. "Just tired. And thirsty and scared. But alive thanks to you." Samuel, who had been watching the entire confrontation with wide eyes, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you. Those men, they were going to take my sister, and I was too weak to stop them." Chaitin studied the young man for a moment, recognizing the guilt and shame of someone who blamed himself for circumstances beyond his control. Strength is not always measured in muscles or weapons, he said quietly. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to accept help. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Vera found herself studying her rescuer more carefully. Everything about him contradicted the stories she had been told about. Indian savages, his educated speech, his controlled behavior, his obvious concern for their welfare. She began to wonder how many other assumptions about the frontier and its inhabitants might be equally wrong. "Why did you help us?" she asked, genuine curiosity overcoming her exhaustion. "We're strangers to you, and we're white." "I thought Indians and whites were enemies." Chayton considered the question seriously before answering. "Some Indians and some whites are enemies." "Yes, but not all. There are good people and bad people in every tribe, every nation, every color. Those men who just left, they were bad people who happened to be white. You and your brother are good people who happen to be white. The difference is important." He moved to his horse and began unpacking supplies: dried meat, water, and other provisions that looked like treasure to the starving siblings. "Besides," he continued, "my mother taught me that courage and family loyalty are virtues that transcend tribal boundaries. What you were willing to do for your brother, that is something any Lakota warrior would understand and respect." As Chayton shared his food and water with the two refugees, as he tended to Samuel's dehydration and examined Vera's injuries, as he made plans for their immediate safety and long-term survival, none of them could have predicted how this chance encounter would change all their lives. The frontier had thrown them together in a moment of crisis, but the bonds being forged in the aftermath would prove stronger than cultural differences, racial prejudices, or the violent conflicts that continued to rage across the territory. For Vera, the intervention had saved not just her life, but her dignity and her hope for the future. For Samuel, it had provided a new model of what strength and honor could look like. For Chayton, it had created an opportunity to act on his deepest values, rather than simply survive in a hostile environment. As the sun began to set over the abandoned trading post, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the three unlikely allies prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The immediate crisis had passed, but their real journey was just beginning. Chayton led them 3 miles north of Morrison's trading post to a sheltered canyon he had discovered during his patrol of the territory. Hidden behind a wall of red sandstone and accessible only through a narrow gap between towering rocks, Canyon contained everything necessary for a secure camp: fresh water from an underground spring, grass for his horse, and defensible positions in case the 3 men decided to return with reinforcements. The setting sun painted the canyon walls in shades of amber and crimson, creating a natural cathedral that seemed untouched by the violence and desperation of the outside world. As they settled around a small fire built from dry cottonwood that produced minimal smoke, Vera felt herself truly relaxing for the first time in weeks. The immediate threats to their survival had been addressed. Samuel was drinking clean water and eating dried buffalo meat that Chayton had shared generously, while she herself had consumed more food in the past 2 hours than in the previous 3 days combined. But beyond the physical relief, she found herself experiencing something she had almost forgotten: safety. Chayton moved around the camp with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to solitary travel. He tended his horse with obvious affection, checked the approaches to their canyon for signs of pursuit, and prepared additional food without making a show of his generosity. Vera noticed that he took only small portions for himself, ensuring that the siblings received the larger shares despite their inability to reciprocate. It was a kindness that went beyond mere charity, reflecting a worldview that valued community welfare over individual accumulation. Samuel, restored to something approaching normal strength by food and water, had become fascinated by their rescuer. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "I've never met an Indian before. I mean, a Native American." "I don't know what's proper to say." Chayton smiled at the young man's obvious effort to be respectful. "Call me Chayton, and you may ask me anything you wish to know." Ignorance is dangerous only when it is willful. The conversation that followed revealed the vast gaps in understanding that separated white and Native American cultures, but also the common human experiences that transcended those differences. Samuel asked about tribal customs, hunting techniques, and spiritual beliefs with the curiosity of youth, while Chayton answered with patient detail, often drawing comparisons to white practices that made the information more accessible. We believe that all things are connected, Chayton explained, using a stick to draw patterns in the sand. The buffalo that provides our food, the horse that carries us, the earth that supports us, the sky that shelters us, all are part of one great circle of life. When we take something, we must give something back to maintain the balance. Vera found herself drawn into the discussion despite her exhaustion. Is that why you helped us? To maintain balance? Chayton considered the question seriously. Partly yes. Those men represented an imbalance, taking without giving, harming without healing. By stopping them, I help restore harmony. But there was more to it than philosophy. Sometimes you act because your heart tells you it is right, and you find the reasons afterward. As the evening progressed, Vera began to understand that her rescue had been part of a larger pattern of conflict and resistance, playing out across the frontier. Chayton spoke carefully about the increasing tensions between his people and the expanding white settlements, about the broken treaties and the cycle of violence that seemed to grow worse each year. My father believes that war is inevitable, he said, staring into the fire. He says the whites will never be satisfied until they have taken everything, and that we must fight now while we still have strength. My mother counsels patience, hoping that wisdom will eventually prevail over greed. I find myself caught between their positions, trying to find a path that preserves what is best in both worlds. The conversation forced Vera to confront assumptions she had never questioned about the nature of civilization and savagery, about the righteousness of westward expansion and the fate of Native American peoples. Everything she had been taught suggested that white settlement represented progress and enlightenment, while Indian resistance represented backward thinking and primitive violence. But Chayton's articulate explanations of his people's perspective revealed a complex worldview that challenged those simple categorizations. You speak better English than most white men I've known, she observed. Where did you learn? Carlisle. Industrial school, Chayton replied, his expression growing somber. The government school where they send Indian children to kill the Indian and save the man. I was there for 6 years, from age 10 to 16. They cut my hair, forbade my language, punished me for practicing my people's customs. The idea was to make me into a white man with red skin. Samuel looked confused. But if they educated you, wasn't that good? I mean, education is important, Chayton nodded thoughtfully. Education is indeed important. But there is a difference between learning new things and being forced to forget old things. I learned to read and write and speak English, yes. But I also learned to be ashamed of my heritage, to see my people through white eyes, to believe that everything about my culture was inferior and worthless. It took me years after leaving Carlisle to remember that my people had wisdom worth preserving. As the fire burned lower and the stars emerged in the clear desert sky, Chayton shared more of his personal history. After leaving Carlisle, he had struggled to find his place in a world that seemed to offer no good options for someone caught between cultures. The reservation meant poverty and dependence, but returning to traditional ways meant constant conflict with an increasingly powerful white civilization. I chose to become a scout because it allowed me to use skills from both worlds, he explained. I could help my people by providing information about army movements, and I could help prevent unnecessary conflicts by serving as a translator and mediator. It is not a perfect solution, but it allows me to follow my own conscience rather than the dictates of either side. Vera found herself studying Chayton's face in the firelight, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes and the strength in his weathered features. Nothing about him matched the stereotypes she had been raised to believe about Native Americans. He was articulate, thoughtful, and possessed of a moral complexity that challenged her understanding of the frontier conflict. "Do you have family?" she asked quietly. "I mean, are you married? Do you have children?" Chaitin's expression grew distant. "I was married once. Her name was Ayana, like my horse. She died 3 years ago during the winter when government supplies failed to arrive at the reservation. Pneumonia took her, but it was really starvation and despair that killed her. We had no children. Perhaps that was a blessing, given how the world treats children caught between races." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Vera felt her heart ache for this man who had lost so much, yet still found the compassion to help strangers. She began to understand that his rescue of her and Samuel was not just an act of kindness, but perhaps also a way of honoring the memory of someone he had been unable to save. The conversation continued deep into the night, with Samuel asking increasingly sophisticated questions about tribal governance, economic systems, and military tactics. Chaitin answered each query with patient detail, treating the young man as an adult capable of understanding complex issues, rather than a child to be protected from harsh realities. "In our society," Chaitin explained, "leadership is earned through demonstrated wisdom and courage, not inherited through bloodlines or accumulated wealth. A war chief must prove his ability to protect the people, while a civil chief must show skill in negotiation and resource management. Both can be replaced if they fail to serve the common good." Samuel compared this to what he knew of American politics, and the conversation evolved into a broader discussion of different approaches to social organization. Vera found herself impressed by her brother's thoughtful questions and insights, realizing that the hardships they had endured had forced him to mature beyond his years. "What will happen to your people in the long run?" Samuel asked with the directness of youth. "I mean, there are so many more whites than Indians, and they keep coming west. How can you preserve your way of life?" Chaitin was quiet for a long moment before answering. "That is the question that haunts my dreams. Perhaps we cannot preserve everything. Perhaps the best we can do is save what is most important. Values, the wisdom, the understanding of our place in the natural world. Physical survival may require cultural adaptation, but spiritual survival requires holding on to what makes us who we are." The next morning, Chaitin made a proposal that surprised both siblings. Instead of escorting them to the nearest settlement, he offered to take them to a place where they could recover their strength and decide their future without immediate pressure from creditors, claim jumpers, or other threats. "There's a valley I know, hidden in the mountains about 2 days. Ride from here. It has everything needed for a temporary settlement: water, game, defensible positions, and isolation from both white and Indian conflicts. You could rest there, heal, and make plans for your future without constantly looking over your shoulders." Vera felt torn between gratitude and uncertainty. "Why would you do this for us? You've already saved our lives." "You don't owe us anything more. Perhaps I owe it to myself," Chaitin replied. "For too long I have moved between worlds without belonging to either. Perhaps it is time to try building something new, something that draws from the best of both cultures while avoiding the worst of each." The journey to the hidden valley took them through some of the most spectacular terrain Vera had ever seen. They rode through narrow canyons where ancient peoples had left paintings on the walls, across high meadows where wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the surrounding desert, and along ridges that offered views of distant mountains that seemed to touch the sky itself. Chaitin proved to be an excellent guide and teacher, pointing out edible plants, explaining animal behavior, and sharing the natural history of the region. Samuel absorbed these lessons eagerly, while Vera found herself developing a new appreciation for the complexity and beauty of the landscape she had previously seen only as an obstacle to civilization. The hidden valley exceeded even Chaitin's descriptions. Nestled between towering peaks and accessible only through a narrow, easily defended pass, It contained several hundred acres of fertile grassland watered by a clear stream that emerged from underground springs. Ancient cottonwoods provided shade and shelter, while natural meadows offered grazing for animals and space for cultivation. "This place is sacred to my people," Chayton explained as they made camp near the stream. "We call it the Valley of Healing Waters, because warriors would come here to recover from wounds both physical and spiritual. It has been neutral ground for generations, a place where even enemies could rest without fear of attack." Vera could understand why the valley had acquired such significance. There was something inherently peaceful about the place, a sense of sanctuary that went beyond its physical advantages. The walls of the valley seemed to shut out the violence and desperation of the outside world, creating a space where different possibilities might be explored. As they established a more permanent camp, working together to build shelters and organize their supplies, Vera began to envision what life might be like in this hidden sanctuary. For the first time since her parents' death, she could imagine a future that included happiness as well as mere survival. Over the following days, the three unlikely companions fell into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Chayton taught Samuel hunting and tracking skills while sharing stories of Lakota culture and history. Vera learned to identify medicinal plants and prepare traditional foods, discovering capabilities she had never known she possessed. The gender roles that had seemed so rigid in white society proved more flexible in their small community. Vera learned to shoot and hunt, while Chayton proved skilled at cooking and healing. Samuel took responsibility for camp maintenance and security, maturing rapidly under the influence of adult responsibilities and expectations. But perhaps most importantly, they began to develop the kind of deep trust and mutual respect that transcended cultural boundaries. Vera found herself looking forward to the evening conversations around the fire, when Chayton would share more of his knowledge and philosophy. Samuel bloomed under the attention of an adult male who treated him as a potential warrior rather than a burden to be managed. "You know," Vera said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the valley walls in shades of gold and purple, "I never thought I could be happy again after losing our parents and our home. But here, now with you two, I feel like I'm part of a family again." Chayton nodded slowly. "Family is not always about blood. Sometimes it is about choice, about the people you decide to stand with when the world becomes dangerous. In Lakota, we have a saying, Mihaku Oyasin. It means we are all related, all part of the same great web of existence." As the days passed, Vera became increasingly aware of her growing feelings for Chayton. It was not the simple physical attraction she had felt for boys her own age, but something deeper and more complex: respect for his character, admiration for his wisdom, and gratitude for his protection, that was gradually transforming into something warmer and more intimate. She caught herself watching him as he worked, noting the grace of his movements and the quiet confidence with which he approached every task. She found herself looking forward to their conversations with an anticipation that had nothing to do with learning about Lakota culture and everything to do with simply being in his presence, but she was also aware of the vast cultural gulf that separated them and the dangers that any relationship between them would face in the outside world. White society would view such a connection as degrading and dangerous, while his people might see it as a betrayal of tribal loyalty. The sanctuary of the hidden valley allowed them to explore possibilities that the larger world would never tolerate. Chayton seemed equally conflicted, treating her with careful respect that sometimes seemed to border on deliberate distance. She could see awareness in his eyes when he looked at her, but also caution and perhaps sadness for the impossibility of their situation. 3 weeks into their stay in the valley, their peaceful existence was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected visitors. A small band of Lakota warriors, led by an older man whose bearing suggested high rank, appeared at the valley entrance and requested permission to enter the sacred ground. Chayton met them at the pass, and Vera could see the tension in his posture as he engaged in lengthy conversation in his native language. When he returned to camp, his expression was troubled. "That was my father, Mapia Luda, and a war council from our band," he explained. "They have been searching for me because events are moving quickly. The army is planning a major offensive against all the tribes, and my father wants me to return to help plan the resistance." Vera felt her heart sink as she realized that their idyllic existence in the hidden valley was about to end. "What will you do?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I must go," Chayton replied simply. "My people need every warrior, every scout, every advantage they can find. The war that has been building for years is finally about to begin." In earnest, Samuel looked stricken. "What about us? What about our plans for the valley?" Chayton's expression grew even more troubled. "That is what we must decide. You can come with me to my band's camp, though I cannot guarantee your safety among people who see all whites as enemies. You can try to reach a white settlement, though you know the dangers that path holds. Or," he paused, seeming to wrestle with himself, "or what?" Vera prompted, "Or you can stay here in the valley and wait for me to return. If I return, it would mean living alone, isolated, dependent on what I have taught you and what you can learn on your own. It would mean trusting that this place will remain sanctuary, even while war rages in the outside world." Mapia Luda, Red Cloud, stood at the edge of the hidden valley like a figure carved from weathered stone, his presence commanding respect, even from those who had never seen him before. At 53, he bore the scars of countless battles and the weight of leadership during the most turbulent period in Lakota history. His war paint spoke of recent victories, but his eyes carried the burden of knowing that greater conflicts lay ahead. When he looked at his son, Vera could see both pride and disappointment warring in his weathered features. "My son speaks the white man's tongue better than his own people's words," Mapia Luda said in English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "He lives in their sacred place with their women, and forgets his duty to the people who gave him life." Chayton's jaw tightened, but he maintained the respectful posture due to a father and war chief. "I have not forgotten my duty, father. But duty takes many forms. These people needed protection, and I gave it. The valley needs guardians, and I have provided them." The older man's eyes moved to Vera and Samuel, assessing them with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. "White settlers," he said, his tone making it clear that this was not a neutral observation. "The same people who steal our land, slaughter our buffalo, and break their promises like twigs underfoot. Why should Lakota blood be spilled to protect those who would destroy us?" Samuel stepped forward with the kind of courage that only comes from youth and desperation. "Sir, I know our people have done terrible things to yours. I know we've taken land that wasn't ours to take. But my sister and we never hurt anyone. We just wanted to farm and live peacefully." Mapia Luda's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Boy speaks with honest heart," he said to Chayton in Lakota, then switched back to English. "But honest hearts do not stop bullets or heal broken treaties. Your people's good intentions matter little when their armies march against our villages." The war council that followed took place in the traditional manner, with all participants seated in a circle around a small fire. Mapia Luda's warriors, 5 seasoned fighters, whose names were spoken with respect throughout the territory, presented their case with the gravity of men who understood that their decisions would affect the survival of their people. "The blue coats are gathering at Fort Laramie," reported Tokala, a scout whose reputation for accuracy was legendary. "More soldiers than we have ever seen, 10 times the number that rode with Custer. They have new weapons, better supplies, and orders to end the Indian problem once and for all." Another warrior, Tatanka Aotanka, spoke of recent attacks on tribal camps, of women and children killed in dawn raids, of sacred sites desecrated by gold miners and settlers. "The time for compromise has passed," he declared. "We must strike first, strike hard, and drive the whites back across the Missouri River while we still have the strength to do so. Vera listened to these reports with growing horror, understanding that the isolated violence she had heard about was merely the prelude to something far more devastating. The war these men were planning would engulf the entire territory, consuming both white and Indian lives in a conflagration that would leave the survivors to inherit a wasteland. "What do you want from me?" Chayton asked his father, though. His tone suggested he already knew the answer. "You know the white man's ways. Speak their language, understand their tactics," Mapialuta replied. "You have skills that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. I want you to come home, take your place among the war leaders, and help us plan the campaign that will determine our people's fate." The silence that followed this request stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Vera understood that Chayton faced a choice that would define not only his own future, but the futures of everyone he cared about. If he went with his father, he would be abandoning the life he had begun to build in the hidden valley. If he stayed, he would be turning his back on his people in their hour of greatest need. "I need time to consider," Chayton said finally. "This decision affects more than just my own life." Mapialuta's expression hardened. "Time is what we do not have. The army moves in 7 days. If you are coming with us, you must decide now." Samuel looked between the Lakota warriors and his sister, understanding that their presence was complicating an already impossible situation. "Maybe we should leave," he said quietly. "Find our own way to a settlement. We don't want to cause problems between you and your father." "No," Chayton said firmly. "You are under my protection. I will not abandon you to face the dangers of the territory alone." Vera felt her heart breaking as she watched the man who had saved her life struggle with competing loyalties. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of responsibility that pressed down on him like a physical burden. In that moment, she realized that loving someone sometimes meant making the hardest choice of all. "Go with your father," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "Your people need you. Samuel and I will find a way. To survive, we've done it before." Chayton looked at her with an expression of gratitude mixed with anguish. "I cannot leave you defenseless. The valley is safe, but you would need supplies, weapons, knowledge of how to survive through winter. And if the war spreads, then teach us." Vera interrupted. "You have 7 days. Use them to prepare us for whatever comes. Show us how to defend this place, how to find food and medicine, how to survive until the war ends." Mapialuta watched this exchange with interest, his warrior's instincts recognizing courage when he saw it. "The white woman speaks like a Lakota," he observed. "She understands that sometimes love means letting go." The 7 days that followed were among the most intense of Vera's life. Chayton threw himself into the task of preparing her and Samuel for survival with the focused dedication of someone who understood that their lives depended on how well he taught them. Every dawn brought new lessons. Every evening brought reviews of skills that might mean the difference between life and death. He taught them to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, to track game and read weather signs, to navigate by stars and landmarks. He showed them how to preserve meat, how to make tools from stone and bone, how to build shelters that would withstand winter storms. Most importantly, he taught them to think like survivors, to conserve resources, to avoid unnecessary risks, to always have multiple plans for every contingency. "The rifle has 15 shots," he explained, demonstrating the care and maintenance of the weapon he was leaving with them. "Make every shot count. If you miss your target, you may not get another chance. Better to let game escape than to waste ammunition on difficult shots." Samuel proved to be an eager student, absorbing information with the intensity of someone who understood that failure meant death. He learned to set snares and traps, to identify dangerous animals and plants, to read the subtle signs that indicated weather changes or potential threats. But it was Vera who surprised everyone, including herself, with her aptitude for survival skills. The same determination that had driven her to offer her life for Samuel's survival now manifested as an almost fierce dedication to mastering everything Chayton could teach her. Beneath the practical instruction ran a deeper current of emotion that all three participants acknowledged, but none dared to address directly. Vera found herself memorizing not just Chayton's lessons, but the sound of his voice, the way he moved, the expressions that crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. She was storing up memories against the loneliness that would follow his departure. Chayton seemed equally affected, treating each lesson as if it might be his last opportunity to protect her. He was more patient than any teacher had a right to be, more thorough than mere instruction required, more gentle than the harsh realities of survival demanded. When their hands touched while he demonstrated proper grip on a weapon or correct technique for preparing medicine, both of them felt the electric connection that spoke of deeper feelings neither could express. Samuel, wise beyond his years, watched these interactions with growing understanding. He could see the love developing between his sister and their protector, and he could also see the tragedy inherent in their situation. His youth made him believe that love should be enough to overcome any obstacle, but his recent experiences had taught him that the world was not always kind to those who followed their hearts. "You love her," he said to Chayton one evening when Vera was gathering herbs near the stream. It was not a question. Chayton was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "But love alone cannot bridge the gap between our worlds. If I stayed, I would be abandoning my people when they need me most. If I take her with me, I would be placing her in danger from those who see all whites as enemies. Either choice leads to pain." Mapialuta's warriors made no effort to hide their impatience with the extended farewell. They had accepted their war chief's decision to give his son time to prepare the whites for survival, but they clearly viewed it as an unnecessary delay in more important matters. Their muttered conversations in Lakota, which Vera was beginning to understand after her weeks with Chayton, expressed frustration with what they saw as misplaced priorities. "The boy thinks with his heart instead of his head," Tokala observed during one of their evening councils. "He risks the welfare of the entire tribe for two white strangers who mean nothing to our people." "Perhaps," Mapialuta replied thoughtfully, "but the ability to care for those who cannot care for themselves is what separates warriors from killers. If we lose that, we become no better than the enemies we fight." Tatanka Iotanka disagreed. "Compassion is a luxury we cannot afford when our people face extinction. Every day we delay gives the army more time to prepare, more opportunity to strike first." The tension within the war party was palpable, and Vera understood that Chayton's decision to help them was creating divisions among people who needed unity to survive the coming conflict. The knowledge that their presence was potentially weakening Lakota resistance efforts added another layer of guilt to her already complex emotions. On the fifth night of their preparation, the peace of the hidden valley was shattered by the Kongta sound of gunfire from the direction of the pass. Chayton reacted instantly, grabbing his rifle and moving toward the sound with the fluid grace of a predator responding to danger. Mapialuta and his warriors followed, their weapons ready and their expressions grim. "Stay here," Chayton commanded Vera and Samuel. "Guard the camp and be ready to run if we don't return." But Vera had not survived the hardships of the frontier by hiding when action was required. She picked up the rifle Chayton had been teaching her to use and followed at a distance, determined to provide whatever help she could if the situation required it. The attack came from a force of 12 men led by the same 3 who had threatened them at Morrison's trading post. They had tracked the group to the valley and brought reinforcements, intending to settle the score that Chayton's intervention had prevented them from collecting. But they had underestimated both the defensive advantages of the terrain and the fighting skills of their opponents. The battle was brief but vicious. The attackers had superior numbers, but were caught in the narrow pass where their advantage meant nothing. Mapialuta's warriors fought with the deadly efficiency of men who had survived countless battles, while Chaitan used his knowledge of the terrain to devastating effect. The turning point came when one of the attackers managed to work his way around the main defensive position and threatened to flank the Lakota warriors. Vera, watching from her concealed position, saw the danger before anyone else and faced a choice that would define her character forever. She could remain hidden and safe, leaving the fighting to the men who were trained for it. Or she could act, using the skills Chaitan had taught her to protect the people who had become her family. The decision took less than a heartbeat. Her shot took the flanking attacker in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his weapon. The sound of her rifle alerted the other defenders to the threat, allowing them to adjust their positions and maintain their advantage. It was not a killing shot. She had aimed to wound rather than kill, but it was accurate and effective. When the shooting stopped and the surviving attackers had fled into the darkness, Chaitan found Vera still crouched behind the rocks where she had taken her shot. Her face was pale but determined, and her hands were steady on the rifle despite the magnitude of what she had just done. "You saved us," he said simply. "That man would have killed at least 2 of my father's warriors. If you had not acted." Mapialuta, who had witnessed the entire sequence, approached with an expression of new respect. "The white woman fights like a Lakota," he announced to his warriors. "She protects the people who have become her family. This is the behavior of a true warrior." The aftermath of the battle brought unexpected changes to the dynamics within their small group. The Lakota warriors, who had previously viewed Vera and Samuel with suspicion and barely concealed hostility, now looked at them with something approaching acceptance. Vera's willingness to risk her life to protect them had earned their respect in a way that words never could. "She has proven herself in battle," Tokala declared. "This gives her the right to speak in council, to be heard as a full member of our war party." Tatanka Iotanka nodded agreement. The spirits guided her shot at the crucial moment. "Perhaps they are telling us that these whites are meant to be part of our struggle." But it was Mapialuta's reaction that mattered most. The war chief studied Vera with new interest, seeing past her white skin to the courage and loyalty that lay beneath. "You fight for people who are not your blood," he observed. "This is the mark of a true warrior. Among my people, such behavior would be rewarded with adoption into the tribe." Vera felt her heart racing as she realized the implications of his words. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means you would become Lakota in the eyes of the spirits, regardless of the color of your skin. You would have the protection of the tribe, the right to participate in our ceremonies, and the obligation to defend our people as you did tonight." What followed was the most extraordinary conversation of Vera's life. Mapialuta, speaking with the formal dignity of a man whose words carried the weight of tribal law, offered her and Samuel something that few whites had ever been given: the opportunity to become full members of the Lakota nation. "The old ways are dying," he said with obvious sadness. "Soon there may be no place left for people like us. No room for those who follow the traditional path. But perhaps new ways can be built that honor the best of both worlds. Perhaps white blood and Indian blood can flow together in the same veins, without losing what makes each valuable." Samuel looked stunned by the offer. "We would be Indians, real Indians?" "You would be Lakota," Mapialuta corrected. "The spirits do not see skin color, they see the heart. And your hearts have proven themselves worthy of our people." But the offer came with conditions that would test their commitment to their new identity. "If you accept adoption into the tribe, you must be willing to fight for our people as they have fought for you. You must be prepared to face the hatred of whites who will see you as traitors, and the suspicion of Indians who will question your loyalty. You must be willing to leave behind the life you planned and embrace one that may be shorter but more meaningful." As dawn broke over the hidden valley, painting the walls in shades of gold and rose, Vera faced the most important decision of her life. She could accept Luta's offer and become part of the Lakota nation, joining Chayton in the struggle to preserve his people's way of life. Or she could continue with her original plan to wait in the valley, hoping that the war would end, and that normal life might somehow resume. But she realized that normal life was an illusion that had been shattered by the violence of the frontier. The choice was not between safety and danger, but between different kinds of danger: the danger of fighting for something she believed in, or the danger of hiding while others fought for their survival. "I accept," she said quietly. "Samuel and I both accept. We want to be part of your people, to fight alongside you, to earn our place in the tribe." Luta smiled for the first time since arriving at the valley. "Then we will perform the ceremony tonight. Tomorrow you will ride with us not as prisoners or refugees, but as Lakota warriors prepared to defend our homeland." Chayton's expression was a mixture of joy and terror as he realized that the woman he loved had chosen to follow him into the heart of the storm rather than remain safely behind. The decision solved some problems, but created others. Now he would have to protect her, not just from the dangers of survival, but from the even greater dangers of war. The sacred fire burned at the center of the hidden valley as the sun disappeared. Behind the western peaks, its flames casting dancing shadows on the faces of those gathered in the ancient circle. Luta had spent the afternoon preparing the ritual element sage for purification, sweet grass for blessing, and the sacred pipe that would seal the adoption into the Lakota nation. The ceremony that was about to unfold had been performed for centuries, but never under circumstances quite like these. Vera knelt beside the fire wearing clothes that Chayton had fashioned for her from deer hide and trade cloth, her auburn hair braided with feathers and beads in the traditional style of unmarried Lakota women. Samuel sat cross-legged beside her, his young face solemn with the understanding that they were about to cross a threshold from which there could be no return. The other warriors formed a circle around them, their painted faces reflecting both acceptance and lingering skepticism about this unprecedented adoption. "In the old days," Luta began, his voice carrying the resonant authority of countless ceremonies, "when our people found orphaned children of other tribes, we would bring them into our lodges and raise them as our own. The spirits do not recognize the boundaries that men draw between peoples. They see only the courage of the heart and the strength of the soul." The war chief raised his hands toward the four directions, speaking first in Lakota and then translating into English for the benefit of the adoptees. "Great Spirit, we call upon you to witness this ceremony. We ask you to look into the hearts of these white people and judge whether they are worthy to become our relatives. We ask you to bless this joining of different bloods in the service of justice and survival." What followed was unlike anything Vera had ever experienced. Luta used sage smoke to purify her and Samuel, brushing away what he called the contamination of the white world's values. The smoke stung their eyes and filled their lungs, but with it came a sense of cleansing that went beyond the physical. They were shedding old identities like snakes shedding skin. Each warrior in the circle stepped forward to offer a gift that would help establish the new identities of the adoptees. Tokala presented Vera with a knife crafted from the finest steel and decorated with beadwork that told the story of a successful hunt. "For the warrior woman who protects her family," he said formally, "may this blade serve you as well as your courage served us." Tatanka Iotanka gave Samuel a bow carved from hickory and strung with sinew, along with a quiver of arrows fletched with eagle feathers. "For the young man who will become a hunter and defender of the people," he declared. "Learn to draw this with honor, and it will never fail you in your hour of need." But it was Chayton who provided the most meaningful gifts, new names that would replace their white identities forever. "You will be called Wichinhin Winyan," he said to Vera, which means brave heart woman, "for the courage you showed in offering your life for your brother, and in fighting to protect our people. And you," he said to Samuel, "will be Canty Waste, Good Heart, for your honest spirit and your willingness to learn our ways." The climax of the ceremony involved a ritual that bound the adoptees to their new people through shared blood. Mapia. Luda used a sacred knife to make small cuts on their palms, then mixed their blood with that of the tribal members in a gourd filled with blessed water. "Now your blood flows with ours," he declared. "What threatens one of us threatens all. What honors one of us honors all. You are no longer white or red, you are Lakota, and that bond cannot be broken by distance or death." Vera felt the sting of the cut and the warmth of the blood that flowed from it. But more than that, she felt something fundamental shift inside her consciousness. The person who had knelt by the fire as Vera Stonefield, desperate refugee from a failed homestead, was being transformed into someone entirely new, a woman with a place in the world, a purpose larger than mere survival, and a family bound by choice rather than accident of birth. As the ceremony concluded and the sacred pipe passed from hand to hand, each participant smoking and offering prayers for the success of their newly expanded family, Vera understood that she had just participated in something that most white people would consider treasonous. She had formally renounced her allegiance to the civilization that had cast her out and pledged herself to a people that white society considered savage enemies. Dawn brought the harsh realities that always followed ceremonial transformation. With Chinhan Winyan, she was already beginning to think of herself by her new name awoke, to find the camp preparing for departure. The war party could no longer delay their return to the main band, and their new Lakota members would have to prove themselves worthy of their adoption through actions rather than words. The process of breaking camp revealed just how different her new life would be from anything she had previously experienced. The Lakota traveled light and moved fast, carrying only essential items that could be easily transported on horseback. Everything that could not serve multiple purposes was left behind, a philosophy that forced constant choices between comfort and mobility. Samuel, now canty waist, adapted to the changes with the flexibility of youth, eagerly learning to pack his gear according to Lakota methods and practicing the writing skills that would be essential for survival on the plains. But Vera found the transition more challenging, struggling to master the complex relationship between rider and horse that the Lakota took for granted. "Your people see horses as tools," Chayton explained as he helped her adjust her seat and improve her balance. "We see them as partners, as relatives who have chosen to help us survive. You must learn to think like your horse, to anticipate what she needs and to provide it before she asks." The lesson proved to be about more than writing technique. It was an introduction to a worldview that saw connection and cooperation where white society emphasized dominance and control. Everything about Lakota culture seemed designed to foster harmony between humans and the natural world, a philosophy that challenged fundamental assumptions about progress and civilization. The ride north toward the main Lakota encampment took them through territory that bore the scars of increasing conflict between white and Indian forces. They passed burned homesteads where settler families had paid the price for their government's broken promises, and they skirted the remains of Indian camps where army raids had left only ashes and graves. Each mile revealed new evidence of the escalating violence that was consuming the frontier. Telegraph lines had been cut and left hanging like broken spider webs. Supply wagons lay overturned and stripped of their contents. Shallow graves marked spots where skirmishes had claimed lives on both sides of the conflict. Mapia Luda used these scenes as teaching moments, explaining the history behind the violence and the complex web of grievances that had led to open warfare. "Your people promised us the Black Hills would remain sacred, forever untouched by white settlement," he said as they paused beside a marker indicating the boundary of the Great Sioux Reservation. Then gold was discovered, and suddenly the promises meant nothing. Treaties signed with great ceremony were broken as easily as dead branches. Vera began to understand that the conflict was not simply about land or resources, but about fundamentally different ways of understanding the relationship between humans and the natural world. White civilization saw nature as something to be conquered and exploited, while Lakota culture viewed it as a relative to be respected and protected. When they finally reached the main Lakota encampment, Vera was stunned by its size and organization. Hundreds of lodges stretched across a vast meadow beside a flowing river, their painted hides telling stories of battles, hunts, and spiritual visions. Thousands of horses grazed in carefully guarded herds, while smoke from countless cooking fires created a haze that softened the harsh edges of the surrounding landscape. But this was not the peaceful village she had imagined. This was an army preparing for war, and every aspect of camp life reflected that grim reality. Warriors painted themselves for battle, while shamans performed ceremonies to ensure victory. Women prepared extra ammunition and emergency supplies, while children too young to fight practiced with miniature weapons. The arrival of Mapia Luta's war party, especially with their unprecedented white adoptees, created a sensation that rippled through the entire camp. Groups of curious onlookers gathered to stare at the newcomers, their expressions ranging from hostile suspicion to genuine curiosity. Some called out questions in Lakota that Vera was just beginning to understand, while others maintained the stoic silence that seemed to be the default expression of seasoned warriors. "They are wondering if you are spies," Chayton explained quietly as they made their way through the crowd. "And they are questioning my father's judgment in bringing white people into our councils at such a critical time. You will have to prove yourself worthy of their trust through your actions." That evening, Vera found herself in a position that no white woman had ever occupied, sitting in a Lakota war council as an official member of the tribe, entitled to speak and vote on matters of life and death. The great lodge where the council met was filled with the most respected war chiefs and spiritual leaders of the allied bands, men whose names were known throughout the territory for their courage and wisdom. The discussion centered on strategy for the coming campaign against the army forces gathering at Fort Laramie. Reports from scouts indicated that the military buildup was even larger than initially estimated, with artillery pieces and cavalry units that would give the soldiers significant advantages in open battle. The traditional Lakota tactics of mobility and surprise would be tested against modern weapons and disciplined formations. "We must strike before they are fully prepared," argued one war chief whose painted face bore the marks of recent victories. "Hit their supply lines, destroy their communications, force them to fight on ground of our choosing rather than theirs," another leader disagreed. "The blue coats want us to attack first, to give them an excuse for total war against all our people. Perhaps we should wait, make them come to us, fight defensive battles where our knowledge of the terrain gives us advantages." Vera listened to these debates with growing understanding of the impossible choices facing the Lakota leadership. They were caught between the need to resist the encroachment on their lands and the knowledge that open warfare could lead to the destruction of their entire way of life. When the discussion turned to the problem of gathering intelligence about army movements and intentions, Vera saw an opportunity to contribute her unique perspective to the war effort. "I could return to the white settlements," she suggested during a lull in the conversation. "My brother and I could gather information about troop strength, supply schedules, and battle plans that would be valuable for planning your strategy." The suggestion created an immediate stir among the council members. Some saw the wisdom in using former whites to infiltrate enemy camps, while others questioned whether such recent converts could be trusted with critical missions. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions within the leadership about how far they were willing to trust their new tribal members. "She knows their ways, speaks their language without accent, could move among them without suspicion," Tokala pointed out. "Information gathered by such a spy could save hundreds of our warriors' lives. But how do we know she will not betray us once she is among her own people again?" countered another chief. "The pull of blood and culture might prove stronger than ceremony and adoption." Chayton spoke up in defense of his adoptees. "I have watched these people for weeks, seen them risk their lives for strangers. make sacrifices for family, show courage under pressure. They have proven their loyalty through actions, not just words. Mapialuda, who had remained silent during the debate, finally spoke with the authority that ended all discussion. The woman will have the chance to prove her loyalty, but not as a spy among the whites. Tomorrow she will accompany our war party on a raid against an army supply train. If she fights well beside us, if she shows courage when bullets fly and blood flows, then we will know her heart truly belongs to the Lakota. The announcement sent a chill through Vera as she realized that her theoretical adoption into the tribe was about to become a very practical test under fire. She would be expected to take up arms against soldiers who might include men she had known, to participate in violence against her former people in order to prove her loyalty to her new ones. "I accept," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly through the lodge. "I will fight beside my new brothers and sisters, and I will prove that my heart belongs to the people who gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go." Samuel looked stricken at the thought of his sister riding into battle, but he also understood that this was the price of their new identities. They could not claim the protection of the tribe without accepting the obligations that came with membership. The next day was spent in intensive preparation for the raid. Chayton worked with Vera to improve her marksmanship and riding skills, pushing her to master techniques that might mean the difference between life and death in combat. Other tribal members contributed their expertise, teaching her to read terrain, to move silently, to communicate through hand signals that would be invisible to enemy observers. But the preparation was not merely technical. Vera also had to prepare herself mentally for the reality of taking human life in battle. She had wounded the attacker at the Hidden Valley, but that had been defensive action in clear self-defense. What she was about to undertake was offensive warfare, deliberate violence against people who might be innocent of any personal wrongdoing. "War is not about personal hatred," Chayton explained as they practiced mounted combat techniques. "It is about survival, about protecting what you love from those who would destroy it. The soldiers you may face tomorrow are not evil men, but they serve a government that seeks to erase our people from the earth. Stopping them is not murder, it is defense of everything that makes life worth living." That evening, Vera participated in another ceremony that prepared warriors for battle, a purification ritual that was designed to ensure that those who fought did so with clean hearts and pure intentions. The medicine man who led the ceremony painted her face with symbols that would invoke the protection of the spirits and marked her weapons with signs that would guide her aim true. "You go into battle not for yourself, but for all the generations that will come after," the medicine man chanted as he worked. "You carry the hopes of the unborn, the prayers of the ancestors, the dreams of those who cannot fight for themselves. Let this knowledge guide your hand and strengthen your heart." The ritual created a sense of connection to something larger than individual survival, a feeling that the coming battle was part of a cosmic struggle between forces of preservation and destruction. Vera felt herself becoming part of a story that stretched back to the beginning of time and forward to an uncertain future. As she lay down to sleep beside the dying fire, knowing that tomorrow would bring her first real test. As a Lakota warrior, Vera reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate refugee offering her life for food. Now she was an adopted member of one of the most formidable warrior societies on the Great Plains, preparing to risk that same life in defense of her new people's freedom. The transformation was complete in all but one final test, the test of fire that would prove whether Wachinhin Winyan, brave heart woman, was truly worthy of the name she had been given. The supply train stretched across the prairie like a great serpent, 20 wagons escorted by cavalry moving slowly through the morning mist. From her position on the ridge, Vera could see the blue uniforms of soldiers who might have been her protectors in another life. Her painted face reflected the rising sun as she checked her rifle one final time, the weight familiar after weeks of intensive training. Mapia Luta's war party had positioned itself perfectly for the ambush, using natural terrain to create killing fields that would maximize their advantage. 30 seasoned warriors lay hidden among the rocks, their horses held ready for rapid retreat. This was not a battle for glory, it was a carefully planned raid to capture supplies and demonstrate that the Lakota could strike anywhere. The signal came as a red-tailed hawk's cry, and suddenly the peaceful morning exploded into chaos. Rifle fire erupted from multiple positions as warriors opened their coordinated attack. Horses screamed and reared, soldiers shouted orders lost in gunfire, and wagon drivers fought to control teams mad with terror. Vera's first shot took down the lead horse of a cavalry charge, sending its rider tumbling. Her second shot shattered a wagon wheel, blocking the retreat of vehicles behind it. Each trigger pull felt like crossing another bridge between her old life and new identity as a Lakota warrior. The battle raged for 20 minutes that felt like hours, with the Lakota using superior mobility and terrain knowledge to devastating effect. But the soldiers were disciplined, quickly organizing a defensive perimeter that made further attacks costly. Vera found herself pinned behind a boulder as bullets chipped stone inches from her head. Then she saw Chayton's horse go down, a lucky shot dropping the animal and trapping its rider. Enemy soldiers immediately advanced on his position, intent on capturing the scout whose reputation had spread throughout the territory. Without thinking, Vera abandoned her covered position and sprinted across open ground toward Chayton, her rifle barking covering fire that forced soldiers to seek cover. Bullets whined around her, but she reached him and helped drag him free from his fallen mount. "Go," Chayton gasped, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Leave me and save yourself. The war party is retreating." "No," Vera replied, firmly, reloading with steady hands despite the chaos. "We go together or not at all." That's what family means. Together they fought their way back toward Lakota positions, covering each other's movements with fluid coordination of partners who had learned to think as one. They moved like dancers performing a deadly ballet, each knowing instinctively what the other would do. The retreat was a fighting withdrawal that tested every skill Vera had learned. The war party had achieved its objectives, wagons burned, horses captured, supplies secured, but the cost was high. As they rode hard across the prairie with cavalry pursuing, Vera felt something fundamental settle within her consciousness. She was no longer pretending to be Lakota, she had become what she claimed to be, that evening in a hidden canyon. As warriors tended wounds and divided captured supplies, Vera found herself at the center of respectful attention that would have been unimaginable days before. Wachin and Winyan fought like a true warrior today, Tokala announced. "She saved one of our best scouts and proved that courage runs deeper than skin color. Any who doubted her loyalty must now acknowledge her place among us." Even the most skeptical warriors nodded agreement, showing newfound respect for the woman who had risked everything to save a fallen comrade. The test of battle had burned away the last vestiges of doubt about her commitment. Mapia Luta approached as she cleaned her rifle, his weathered face showing approval mixed with paternal pride. "Today you became truly Lakota," he said simply. "Not through ceremony, but through blood and courage shared in battle. My son chose well." That night, Chayton found Vera sitting apart from the others, staring at stars that seemed close enough to touch. She had washed the war paint from her face, but her eyes still held the distant look of someone processing the profound experience of surviving deadly combat. "How do you feel?" he asked, settling beside her. "Different," she replied after a long moment. "Like someone I used to know died today, and someone new was born. I can never go back to being the woman who knelt in the dirt begging for food. That person doesn't exist anymore. I love you," she said quietly, the words carrying the weight of everything they had shared. Not as a grateful refugee loves her rescuer, but as a woman loves the man she wants to spend her life with. "And I love you," Chayton replied, his voice rough with emotion. I have loved you since I watched you offer your life for your brothers. Survival. Now we build something together that honors both our peoples. Over the following days, as they returned to the main encampment, Vera and Chayton discussed possibilities for a future that seemed impossibly complex. The war was far from over, but perhaps there were ways to bridge the cultural divide that went beyond individual love. Perhaps people like us, those who belong to both worlds and neither, can help build something that allows different peoples to live together rather than destroy each other. Chayton said as they rode across the endless prairie, Samuel had found his own path within Lakota society. His quick mind and honest nature had earned him a place among younger warriors, and he was being groomed for leadership responsibilities impossible in white society. The desperate boy who had nearly died of starvation had become a confident young man with clear purpose. The ultimate test came when they encountered white homesteaders whose wagon had broken down while fleeing the violence. The family, a man, woman, and 3 children, were stranded with no hope of reaching safety alone. Some warriors argued for leaving the whites to their fate. Others suggested taking them prisoner. But Vera saw an opportunity to demonstrate the values that could guide a different future. These people are not our enemies, she said, addressing the war council with earned authority. They are refugees, just as Samuel and I were. If we help them reach safety, we show that Lakota honor extends even to those who might not deserve it. Eventually, Mapialuda supported her position, and the war party escorted the family to safety, asking nothing in return except that they remember Lakota kindness when others spoke of Lakota savagery. 6 months after kneeling in the dirt at Morrison's trading post, ready to sell her life for her brother's survival, Vera stood as Wichinhan Winyan in the council lodge, her voice carrying weight in discussions that would determine thousands of fates. She had become a bridge between worlds, a translator of values that seemed irreconcilable. Her marriage to Chayton was celebrated according to Lakota custom, with ceremonies that honored both their individual achievements and their commitment to building something larger than themselves. Samuel stood as witness, his presence a reminder of how far they had all traveled from that desperate day when death seemed preferable to dishonor. You gave me more than food that first day, Vera told Chayton as they stood before the sacred fire. You gave me back my dignity, my purpose, my belief that the world could be something better. Now we build that better world together, one choice at a time. The war continued across the territory, and many battles lay ahead before lasting peace could be achieved. But in their corner of the vast frontier, 3 people brought together by desperation had created something that transcended the hatred defining their era. As stars wheeled overhead and the sacred fire burned low, Wichinhan Winyan and Chayton, Iron Wolf, began their new life together, carrying the hope that love could prove stronger than forces seeking to divide their peoples. They had learned that home was not a place but a choice, that family was about commitment, not blood, and that sometimes the greatest courage was refusing to let cruelty destroy your capacity for kindness. The circle was complete, but it was also just beginning.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.